Okay, this evening what we're doing is we're starting with to look at the biblical text proper. The first few sessions we have gone over a bunch of preliminary matters, the biblical text, manuscripts, the different approaches to especially to the Pentateuch, since that's what we're talking about first, and the like. Um, talked about how my approach to the Pentateuch fits uh, best into what's known as tradition history, my approach. Um, and when that becomes relevant, we'll talk about that. Uh, but so we're going to give an overview of Genesis now. Now, let me just share my screen here. I have some notes that I want to look at. Let me see. Do those side by side. There we go. That's what I want to do. Let me get sorry about this. Need to find my notes. There we go. There they are. Let me see. Okay. Let me stop sharing for a little bit. I need to back up here and get what I want to view front and center here. There we go. So let me reshare. Okay. Share screen. There we go. And so we've done this stuff with the Pentateuch, we've done the history, we've done the narrative flow of the Pentateuch, but now we're at Genesis. Genesis, of course, Genesis in the beginning is how the Hebrew starts, Bereshit, in the beginning, um, from the Greek text, Genesis. Genesis divides naturally into two pieces. We have Genesis 1 to primeval history, or as Arnold and Beyer in their introduction to the Old Testament calls it, the problem. I sort of like that. So I have it right here. The problem. And then we'll have 12 to 50 later called the solution. And so some of the themes that we see, the theme is God, top course creation, the fallenness of humankind. Humans very much get into trouble right away. Um, different things we'll talk about, maybe not tonight. We might have a whole session devoted to the image of God, what the message of the creation stories are. But tonight we're just doing more of a general introduction. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail tonight, but this is how it's brought here's how the first 11 chapters of Genesis break down. Creation. 3, we have the fall. 4, Cain and Abel. Chapter 5, the genealogy of Adam. 6 to 9, flood and its aftermath. 10, table of nations. 11, Tower of Babel. Put here First World Empire. We'll talk about approaches to creation later, so I'm going to skip that for now. But we'll get back to it. And so and both sections of Genesis, both the primeval history and the patriarchal history or problem and solution are divided. There's little hooks to hang the material. And that's this phrase that talks about generations. Hebrew word toledoth. I like how the King James, I generally don't use the King James, but I like how they've translated the word toledoth. You often translated history, but that really doesn't get to the issue that the term yalad, where it's taken from, or walad. Uh, it's a very much a Semitic root where we get the word for child from, yeled, uh, walid in Arabic. Uh, uh, Talks about has the idea of generating something, offspring, and the like. So something emerges out of the other, which the translation history sort of misses that element of the word. So I prefer generations better. Okay, so we have several occurrences of this in 1 to 11, and we have several occurrences in 12 to 50. Here are the ones where it occurs in Genesis 2 to 4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Genesis 5:1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. 6:9. These are the generations of Noah. 10:1. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Genesis 11:10. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So that's from 1 to 11. Now, what we see after Genesis 1 to those that first set really begins at 11:27. And the story of Abraham, interestingly enough, isn't introduced as the story of Abraham. Interestingly, it's introduced as the generations of Terah. Now, that's Abraham's father. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Ham, and Haran begat Lot. Now, these are the generations of Ishmael. So we have Abram, we have Ishmael, son of Ishmael. Now, these are the generations of Isaac. Now, these are the generations of Esau. These are the generations of Jacob, which we have the Joseph story. So what we can see here is that it's divided in these two equal parts, and what the story was supposed to be about is sometimes surprising. Genesis 11:27, the story of Jacob the story of Abraham is from the generations of Terah. The story considered of Isaac we have Isaac. We have this in that we have the story of Jacob, and then so generation of Isaac talks about Jacob. Generation of Terah talks about Abram, later Abraham. The generations of Jacob talk about Joseph. And so it has to do with what comes out of them often rather than the person themselves. That's important to remember as we delve into Genesis. So we have these two. It's the major way that is organized. One thing we can say about Genesis 1 to 11 is we have this slide into what I like to term in 3 to 5 especially a slide into violence which leads to the flood, and afterward we have a slide into we quickly come into trouble again. By the time we get to chapter 11 of Genesis, and then what we see is we have the Tower of Babel, the first world empire, so to speak, is what it kind of symbolizes for me, where the variety and stuff in the world that is God's design. In chapter 10, we have the world's first empire who tries to remove that, who tries to impose one language. And so God comes down, sees what's going on, and confounds their attempt to build a name for themselves. So that's the first 11 chapters. And what we see develop will in the next session we have sometime later, probably Friday, maybe before then, which would be tomorrow. Today's Wednesday, is I will illustrate what I'm about ready to talk about. So what we see laid out in 1 to 11 is two different forces in the world, way of organizing, sort of basically what we'll talk about is sociological mechanisms for the image of God to be played out. One is through the extended family, and the other is through empire and kingship. And these two ways of doing things, so to speak, are clashing in 1 to 11. And we see starting at 11:27 with the emergence of Terah on the scene, the father of Abram, that it's through the extended family that God is choosing to work. We have Genesis 12, 1-3, where Abram is sent to find a land that God will show him so that God may bless him. Well, let's just look at that passage. I should have had that passage up, but let me stop sharing for a moment while we find that passage. ESV. So this is how, let me just share the screen again now. Here we go. And so here we have the call of Abram. We'll delve more into this next session when we start digging into the text more so, but kind of now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you, or better yet, so that I may make of you a greatness, so that I may bless. Those the Hebrew there is volatives. In other words, it's what God wants to do. Says, I will bless you, and will him who dishonors you I will curse, and you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So this passage sets up what's to follow in the next section of Genesis. We have the story of Abram. It's divided into three parts, basically, with kind of connective material between them. We have the story of Abram from 12 to 22. We have the story of basically the story of Jacob from about 25 to 36. And then we have the story of Joseph, 37 to the end of the book, 37 to 50. So those are the three major narrative blocks in Genesis 12 to 50. And so let's talk about this. One thing we're going to do, which isn't done, we're not going to exclusively do this, but one thing we're going to do, when I talk about the image of God, when I talk about all those things that are so important, talk about covenant, I'll talk a little bit about Paul's use of Genesis. But one thing we're going to do when we start talking about Genesis in more detail next time, because I'll wrap up pretty soon, is we're going to talk about Genesis as Genesis. Genesis as in and of itself, and what this passage has to say in that context. And what, of course, isn't the only context when we have to read it, but 12, 1 to 3 is largely fulfilled to a large extent if we look at it within the narrative of Genesis itself. By the time you get to Genesis 50, this promise to Abraham is in a sense fulfilled in the life of Joseph. So we'll talk about that. Doesn't mean this can't be reinterpreted for other uses because it is. But as far as the role it plays in Genesis, treating Genesis as kind of this integral narrative, it's fulfilled in the life of Joseph. So we'll talk about that in more detail. And we'll talk about interpreting the passage beyond that as well. So Genesis 2 sections, Genesis 1 to 11, Genesis 12 to 50, the problem and the solution. I'm getting that from Bill Arnold and Bryant Beyer in there. I think his name's Brian. If it's not, I'm sorry. In their introduction to the Old Testament, which is a good undergrad text. I would recommend it if you are wanting to buy one at a college level. That's a good text to have. So, and it is structured, and it's structured on these are the generation statements, about 5 in each section of Genesis. With that, I'm going to let you go for now, and either tomorrow or Friday, we'll begin a closer look at Genesis 1 to 11. We'll probably spend quite a bit of time there because there's a lot of important material to look at, especially when it comes to what is the creation narrative trying to communicate to us. And to relate to that is what does humans being made in the image of God mean? But that's for next time. For today, I'm going to let you go. So bye for now. Take care. God bless.